All right, welcome everyone to St. Louis County Library's virtual program, a 3-year Suburban Makeover. And this will be presented by Dave Tylka, and we'll have more about him in just a moment. In the meantime, I'm Sarah Jones, and I am the Adult Programming Coordinator for St. Louis County Library. And before we get started, I wanted to bring to your attention a few helpful tips in case this is your first Zoom program with us, at least. This is a webinar, so that means you should be able to see and hear us, but we cannot see or hear you. We are recording this, so it will be available on our YouTube page within a few days. You'll receive an email when with the link when it's posted. We do also have subtitles now, so if you click the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen, you can turn those subtitles off or on. You can make them bigger or smaller under the subtitle settings in this little menu in the on that button. And then if you have any difficulties with your connection at all, we do recommend that you exit the webinar, move closer to your Wi-Fi router, wherever you may be, and click the link used to join to come right back. We will have the chat turned on during the program, so feel free to submit questions or comments as they occur to you. That would be very helpful. We have a lot of you here today, so I appreciate any questions you have. If you put them as you think of them, that'll help me to organize the Q&A at the end of the presentation. And before we get to the presentation, I do want to just give you a few reminders about programs with St. Louis County Library. First, please remember you do not need to have a library card or even be a resident of St. Louis County to attend our virtual programs, or any of our programs, really. We hope you enjoy yourself or learn something new today, and tell your family and friends about the program experience, and you're welcome to share any information like the recording link with them too, so please feel free. Today's program is a part of the it is a part of the Partners for Native Landscaping series. I don't know how I couldn't read that right in front of my face. The Partner for Native Landscaping series, and the next couple of programs are Life in the Soil, presented by Jerry Pence with St. Louis Community College, and that's tomorrow, Wednesday, March 16th at 7 p.m. We also have Native Plant Gardens Bring Pollinators next Tuesday, March 22nd at 2 p.m., and that'll be presented by Nina Fogel and Jenny Milliken, Billiken Bee Lab at St. Louis University. So those are just two of the next that are upcoming, and you can register for these and the other programs in the Partners for Native Landscaping series or any St. Louis County Library program by going to www.slcl.org/events. Also, don't forget that you can catch up on most any program you miss, including those in this webinar, by checking out the library's YouTube channel. And I'm going to put the link to all these things in the chat in a moment, as well as a survey to provide the Partners for Native Landscaping some feedback about today's webinar. So if you get a chance, we appreciate you taking a minute to fill that out before you move along with your day. So we appreciate that, as I said. Okay, so now I'd like to introduce you to this afternoon's presenter, Dave Tylka. He has been teaching and practicing conservation for 50 years, with about 40 years experience in the native landscaping movement. Serving as the first St. Louis urban biologist for the Missouri Department of Conservation, he is a biology professor, co-founder of Audubon's Bring Nature Home program, and an author, writing the Missouri Department of Conservation book, Native Landscaping for Wildlife and People, which somebody had already mentioned in the comment how much they appreciated that book and they used that in their work. So today he brings together a wealth of practical information on native landscaping around the home for this program, the 3-year Backyard Landscaping Makeover. Thank you for being with us, Dave, as a part of the Partners for Native Landscaping webinar series.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for the St. Louis County Library. Hello, home gardeners. Wow, what a fall and winter. Hope your cabin fever is cured with these nice warm temperatures of late, and now you're ready to get your hands in the soil and plant some natives. For background information, the property that you're going to see today has been vacant for a year or more, and the yard was neglected for over 2 to 3 years. So we had our challenges at the beginning. In this presentation, I'm going to show you some boring word lists and chart at the beginning, and then I'll show you many colorful before and after pictures and pictures of the progress in between. So we're going to go ahead here and start the presentation. It's a 3-year Suburban landscape makeover, or you can see how we have progressed as we went from year 1 to 2 to 3. So here we go. All right, as far as goals, I wanted to show everyone what can be accomplished in 3 years of native landscaping with the right approach. My guidelines were to share the landscape with pleasurable species of wildlife, exciting native plants that have evolved locally, and these are the ones that are beneficial to pollinators, songbirds, hummingbirds, butterflies, all the good stuff. And it's also designed to help capture or sequester carbon with the native plants, especially the woodies, the trees and shrubs. We also want to show you a healthy life in the landscape by reducing toxins in your yard, and also at the same time restore functional garden beds which serve as mini versions of natural communities such as prairies, forests, woodlands, glades, etc. And there is not such of an animal as maintenance free. A landscape needs maintenance, but I'm going to show you some hints, techniques that we've used to reduce the amount of maintenance. But above all, please realize, be flexible and adaptable. Landscape should be enjoyable and not a source of stress. Okay, here's my word list. These are the boring ones, just to get it out of the way at the beginning. I have a 4-step process. First of all, you do a basic assessment. You find out what the sun and shade patterns are, how much sun you're going to get here, how much shade here. You're going to see how the rain runs off of your property, where it pools. You're going to do a preliminary plant inventory of all the perennials and woody plants that you have on your property. And then after that, you probably want to plan on eliminating some of the pardon me, whoa, they take your breath away. The invasives, especially the non-native invasives, which you want to go ahead and eliminate. The second step is to, of course, formulate a landscape plan. Here you want to identify possible locations for your prairie beds, your glade beds, forest beds, and potential rain gardens. You want to begin, though, with the beds that you start from seeds, because they will take the longest to go ahead and establish. Then next, you want to plant the beds with the small potted seedlings, and if you have a little extra money, you can plant then beds with large potted plants. You want to select species that are beneficial to wildlife, that have a good full bloom chronology, which means you have some stuff blooming in the spring, the summer, and the fall. And of course, you want to have pretty things, aesthetically pleasing species. I always encourage people to put their beds put borders around their beds, especially hardscapes, stones, cement blocks. I used to do wood, but I don't recommend that anymore because after the years, they will disintegrate and deteriorate. Then you want to implement your plan, and you want to prepare the site, reduce the number of weeds or weed seeds as best you can, even using some weed fabrics or other techniques, which we'll talk about. Then you want to get your hands in the soil, dig, plant, and water. And if you plant from seed, you really have to keep those seedlings moist for the first few weeks. Then you can add structural features at your own leisure here. You can add breeding sites, which are bird and bee houses. I'll be talking about solitary bees today. They are a great source of pollination. Everyone keys into honeybees and bumblebees, you know, but those are the more social bees. But I'm going to be emphasizing the small, tiny bees, like the leaf cutters, the mason bees, all of these, and I'll just generally group those as solitary bees. And we'll also talk about storing some plant stems from your prairie as well. We want to key into watering sites, such as bird baths, bubblers, wildlife pools, and then finally, rain gardens. Rain gardens are really functionally a great idea, and you'll have a talk on that later. All right, so here's our house from the air. This is an aerial, and you can see the compass directions here, south, and then of course, north, east, whatever. The gradient, the house sits up in the front, and it drains to the backyard. It drains to the backyard. We have existing vegetation. We have most of our trees and most of our forest in the back. We have a couple of street trees, an ash tree and a bur oak tree in the front. We used to have a tree over here. And in the front yard, this is a big front yard right here that's full sun, and there are some big rocks here. So this is the property from the air. All right. My chronology, we basically moved in March of 2018, and I did some preliminary elimination of invasives, but I actually started my planting on May 26th. Well, we'll just say June 8th of 2018, I started planting. And as I said in my guidelines, I started with the beds that are started from seed. So I started with my backyard prairie. Now I'll distinguish the difference between a backyard prairie and a front yard prairie soon. Other beds with small seedlings, I started in the summer and in the fall. At the end of the first year, which was June 19th, during that year, we put in a vine trellis, we put in many shrubs, and we increased species diversity to our perennial beds. In 2020, this is year two, the end of year two, we put in some bee and bird and bat houses, and again, did some tweaking and species in the beds. And then the end of year three, which was June of 2021, we did add a bubbler, and I'll talk about bubblers right before rain gardens today. All right, so here we go. This was March of 2018 or April, early April. What we were looking at is in the northeast corner, this was a bush honeysuckle thicket. It had a lot of weeds, which I started clearing out. All this small vegetation was removed. You can see right here. All of that was just all full of different types of weeds, bush honeysuckle in all sorts of sizes. But the two big bush honeysuckles were 15, 20 feet high. I cut those down at the beginning of spring here. So the herbicide, and here I used generic glyphosate, which is the ingredient in Roundup, with proper caution, proper safety gear. I used the concentrate and painted the freshly cut stumps so they would not sprout in the future. I think the Missouri Department of Conservation recommends at least a 20% concentrate. I think I used something like a 50%. All right, so here's the view from the bush honeysuckle thicket, or what used to be the bush honeysuckle thicket. Here is where I wanted to put our backyard prairie. And I thought it would be best to put the tall, 5 to 7 foot tall species that would work here, and they would outcompete a lot of the weed seeds because there were a lot of weeds in this area. I thought about growing this from seedlings, but for economic reasons, it's cheaper. I chose to plant with mostly seeds. The rainwater, if you look at the general lay of the land, you can see the lot slopes back to the backyard right over here. on both sides of the house. And there are a lot of expanses of bare concrete here that I would like to, along the way, cover up with native plants. All right. When we first got here, we were amazed at the amount of rabbits in the neighborhood. There were also little seedlings that had been nibbled by the rabbits. And if I'm going to put a prairie out here, I didn't want to provide them with a bunch of extra rabbit habitat. So I used a rabbit fence to keep the rabbits out. And this area is about the size of what, 10 by 15. As you can see later, I did double the size of this, but I started out with about a 10 by 15 area. The soil was hard packed. I thought I could rake it up or use that circular tine thing that you rough up the soil with. That didn't work. So basically I had to use a tiller. But I didn't want to till the soil deeply, because the deeper you till the soil, the more weed seeds you bring up. So I tilled as shallowly as possible. And here's the result. That's tilled and raked. I used a big aluminum rake here to level it out and to rough up the soil. I used a mixture of prairie seeds that I had collected from my old prairie beds and kept in the garage refrigerator. If you don't have access to a friend's source of seeds or seeds from other places, you'll maybe have to go to a native plant nursery and buy some of those. Some of them have mixtures. But I keyed into about 3 keystone species as a matrix for the backyard prairie. The gray-headed coneflowers, a tall mint called wild bergamot, and then New England aster. There was a few other species, but these are my 3 main ones. And when I planted the seeds, I didn't want to put them in the ground very deeply. You just want to rough it up, maybe rake it in a little bit. You just want a little bit of seed soil contact. And here you can see the seedlings coming up out of the ground. And you got to keep these watered for at least 3 weeks. Make sure that they do not dry out, because seedlings really need that moisture at the beginning. And here you can see about 5 weeks later how the weeds are coming on, but so are some of these native plants. And periodically, I would go out and weed out the bigger weeds, such as tall nut sedges, before they went to seed. However, with the abundant reservoir of seeds, weed seeds in the soil, I knew it was impossible to get rid of all the clovers and violets and wild strawberries and all these things, but realize that the taller prairie plants will eventually outcompete these sharp weeds and eliminate them. Succession. And here you can see the prairie basal leaves. Basal leaves are the leaves that grow on the lowest base of the plant near the ground. Okay, and these later then produce stems and flowers. Here you can see the basal leaves of the bergamot and the gray-headed coneflowers and some of the New England asters that are getting tall enough to outcompete the nut sedges. See the nut sedges in there and all the other weeds. So we'll move on to about a year down the road. At our 1-year anniversary in the spring, you can see the basal leaves of the prairie plants are vibrant green and getting ready to send up stems and flowers. So that's looking really nice after about a year's growth from seed. And at that point, I increased the size of the prairie. So here's the original fence. I started planting seeds in here, added a few more seedlings, and then I'm going to bring my fence out here, and I'm going to end up with about a 15 by 25 size prairie area for prairie. If you are new to starting prairies from seed, there is a suggested general rule of thumb. Start small and see how it goes. if you're happy with the first results, slowly increase it. For me, I was happy. And I bought another roll of the green colored rabbit proof fencing to surround the larger patch of backyard prairie. At 13 months, I was starting to get flowering from my gray-headed coneflowers and my wild bergamot, two of my 3 keystone species. So from seed, these will start flowering in about 13 months. At 16 months, now we're getting into the fall. We're getting into the fall. In the fall, a lot of these gray-headed coneflowers and other species starts to fade because, again, the time to shine for prairies is in the summer. So in the fall, the tall New England asters are producing nectar for fall butterflies such as skippers and monarchs and colorful solitary bees. Now realize in good soils, New England aster can grow over 6 feet tall, sometimes even 7 or more. If you want to end up with 4-foot tall plant and not greatly affect the flowering, what I did is I cut off about 1 foot off the top when the plant got to about 4 foot tall. Then it will slowly grow back that lost foot and it won't grow up to 7 foot tall. Okay. So some of these you can see over here are really tall. I cut some of these other ones. I was sort of experimenting a little bit. All right, at 26 months, many prairie species grown from seed are now flowering. So some of these species, it takes 2, sometimes 3 years before they start to flower. But you can see the diversity coming in from these additional species besides the 3 keystone. You get the blazing stars, the coneflowers, all these different species coming in. In the fall of that second year, at 29 months, you can see that backyard prairies sometimes look a little ragged as the leaves and stems start to turn brown. However, realize that bees and butterflies, like the migrating monarchs and the honeybees, are still active. The bumblebees are still active. The predators, such as this praying mantis, is still active. And the purple asters and the multi-branched white heath asters are important nectar sources for these fall animals. In the third year, here it was in full splendor. Great diversity, fully functional. You can see the clearwing moths nectaring at the common milkweed, the hummingbirds at the royal catchfly, hairy mountain mint, Joe Pye weed, ironweed, and Riddell's goldenrod. Now there are good goldenrods and there are bad goldenrods. You need to, in a tall prairie, maybe key in on a couple of species such as Riddell's and showy goldenrod. The reason why I'm adding this is because here's a bad one. The tall goldenrods, Altissima and Canadensis, the Canadian and the tall goldenrods. These 2 species are very invasive, although they are natives, but they are prolific seed producers. They are, look at these rhizomes. They spread, and at nodes along there, a new plant will come up. And if you try to pull them out when the ground is dry and hard, they will break off and you'll get more of the sprouts coming up. So wait until the good heavy rain, the ground is moist, and then you can dig these up and pull them out a little bit. But you got to keep some of these invasive plants out of your prairie or they will take it over. Okay. And if you want to, if you want to put a little dressing on your prairie for aesthetic reasons, I framed the 2 ends of the prairie with 2 very nice functional shrubs. You can see the elderberry over here in the lower part of the prairie and prairie willow in the front. The 3 slides on the top are the common elderberry. beautiful full flower head, which produces the berries, which can be eaten by animals or people. Make wine, jams, jellies out of that. And if you don't get to them soon, though, you'll end up with this, because the songbirds really relish the fruits of the common elderberry. The prairie willow is an excellent early nectar source and pollen source for the solitary bees and some of the flower flies, but they are attractive on their own as well. Now realize that the seed heads are excellent seed sources to supplement your bird feeding if you're a bird feeder. The gray-headed coneflowers, wow, the goldfish really love them, along with rattlesnake master and the bergamots and other things. But realize inside these seed stems, a lot of insects lay their eggs. And what I do every February at the beginning of March, in fact, I just did this a couple of days ago, I harvest vertical stems because they are insect homes. And I harvest some of the bigger ones. I put them in some of these large plastic pots and stick them in a frame. You can see I haven't spent a lot of time with my frame. I just have something hidden away in the backyards, and I leave the stems of that year until the next year. And then I end up with sun getting to all these prairie plants and warming them up and starting to metabolize here. And I don't lose all my organic material, because then I take the stems from the last year and I run over them with my lawnmower so the organic material stays there on site. Okay, so that's my explanation on my backyard prairie. Here's the aerial again. This was the backyard prairie, which was the bush honeysuckle thicket. Now I'm going to concentrate on this area right here. It has fairly good soil, but full sun most of the day. Here is where I'm going to put in my front yard prairie. All right, here it is at ground level. Here's the big rocks you saw, some boxwoods, which I got rid of, composted. I left this for a few months, but I finally got rid of this in about a half a year. I left this one for the songbirds. There was a couple of song sparrows that were nesting in this one. But what I decided to do here in the front yard prairie, as opposed to the backyard prairie, is go with shorter prairie plants. Instead of 5 to 7 foot tall perennials, I chose 3 to 4 foot perennials that were stiff stemmed, that were showy and highly functional. And this is where my showcase prairie is going to be. Okay, I planted about 60 seedlings in this area. The area is about 15 by 20. I use the, again, natural stone edging the borders, not wood, not landscape timbers or anything like that, because they break down too quickly. Now, this area was chock full of dandelions, plantain, and a lot of other weeds, and also cool season non-native grasses like fescue. So I decided to put down a weed fabric for the first year to kill the weeds, and then I removed it the second year when the perennials got going and filled in some of the gaps. This temporary weed fabric helps me reduce maintenance. For aesthetics, I scattered mulch to cover up the fabric. And like I said, I kept this evergreen right here for a few months, but then I removed it and I replaced it with 2 species of small native shrubs, aromatic sumacs and golden currants, to give that transition into those big rocks. Kept the big rocks there. Grandkids love to climb on them. All right. 6 months later, it was going into dormancy. You can see my seedlings. The only seedlings that really flowered were the rattlesnake masters, but not much else. And again, I focused on 4 keystone species: the rosy sedge, the rattlesnake masters, the blazing stars, and then the purple coneflowers. And about a year later, you can see the progress of the basal leaves in April. It's amazing how fast these these guys grow. This was in the 7th of April. And then 3 weeks later, you can see when the warmth comes along, they start to really kick it in and they really get a lot of nice growth here at the end of April. But again, remember, prairies shine, the peak blooming is in the summertime, okay? And here we are then in July. In July, the rattlesnake masters, the white bulb flowers here are starting to come on, the purple cone flowers, you can see them. So, and here is 14 months from seedlings. This is a front yard prairie. It's high on aesthetics, it's high on stiff-stemmed prairie plants that are not real tall, okay? The wildlife loves this prairie. I met more neighbors at this front yard prairie than any other place. I mean, it was like a magnet. People, how did you get that? I saw these and oh man. And we had many wonderful conversations because people would stop and they would talk about the goldfinch they saw feeding on the coneflower seed heads or the butterflies they saw. There were people out there with cameras coming by. Can I take a picture of, heavens yes. And we had a chance then to talk about native plants. Here are some of the beautiful flower heads that are so attractive. All the white ones here, the round ball-shaped white flowers are called Rattlesnake Master, which is a cool name, Rattlesnake Master. Grandkids love it. The swallowtails, the snout butterflies, the solitary bees, you can see the cone flowers, both purple and yellow, the blazing stars, which the bumblebees absolutely love. And then, like I said, anything with nice seeds on them, like coreopsis or cone flowers, the goldfinch are going to hammer. So, and of course, you have to tweak things. You want to add a few more species here. And I found out the best way of tweaking the prairie is to get an auger from the hardware store and make these small holes. And then that way you can get these tiny little seedlings and you can just sort of stick them in around the edges. So that's how I really got the front yard prairie going, is with seedlings at first and then add a little spice down the road. All right. Now, you don't always have to put prairie plants in big beds like a backyard prairie or a front yard prairie. Here I took advantage of mildly aggressive prairie plants to overcome some unwanted aggressive plants. On the east side of our house here, we have a large, ugly expanse of bare concrete between the siding and the ground. And it was next to our major pathway from the front yard to the backyard. It didn't look like there was a lot of vegetation growing. There's onions there until later. By June, it was overrun with non-native plants such as peonies, daylilies, weeds like nutsedge, dandelions, plantain. It was a mess. It was and two species of aggressive native vines. Neighbors told me later that this was neglected for over 2 years and it became a tangle of weedy crap in the summer. So I don't have a fondness for daylilies. They're functionally not as good as so many natives. I got rid of that. I did keep the peonies, but the two vines that really gave me trouble were the native trumpet creepers with this tremendously long root system here that does not pull out very easily, and the milkweed vines, which always break off. They always come back. They're very opportunistic. Realize practically all vines are really labor intensive. They're high maintenance. The phrase we gardeners use is they have to be chased all the time. And I would recommend that they should only be grown where you have structural support. I'll show you an example of vine structural support a little later. But these two vine species were hard to eliminate because they produced a lot of seeds and the roots broke off and new growth occurred from the remnant plants. So I decided to plant some semi-tall aggressive prairie plants that would outcompete most other plants and screen a good portion of the concrete wall. In about 2.5 years, these yellow prairie coreopsis and wild quinine, the little slender mountain lint, were all flowering well. But I want to give a shout out to 2 species of tall, aggressive, multi-branch prairie plants that not only provided good screening, but were also fantastic pollinator plants, attracting a wide diversity of insects, such as the wasp, the predatory wasp like the golden digger, the thread-waisted wasp, the skipper butterflies, and a lot of the flower flies, the bee mimic flies. Okay, this was unbelievable when it came to pollinators. The second shout out species in the fall is this Aromatic Aster. In the second year of growth, I did nothing to this rather aggressive species, and this is what happened. It grew way out of the bed and it started spilling over onto the walkway. So that was my mistake. I learned from that. The next year, I trimmed it back. I trimmed it back early. And the haircut really didn't hurt flowering much at all. Both of these species outcompeted everything else, which besides the trimming did not require much weeding maintenance. So hooray. So looking back at the aerial, right here is the hottest part of our yard, the southwest corner. If we take nature as the example, where do you find the hottest desert-like places in the natural communities? The glades, the glades. So here is an excellent place to put a mini natural area, like the glades that grow down by Hillsborough in Jefferson County. This is all poor, dry, rocky soil, nutrient poor soil. So I wanted to maybe try a glade bed at the southwest corner of the house. If you're wondering what the differences are between a prairie habitat and a glade habitat, I made this little handy dandy chart here. Prairie plants like rich, moist soil, but glade plants like poor, dry soil. Prairie plants grow a little taller, glade plants grow shorter. So when you're looking at specific species in a prairie planting versus a glade planting, you want to go like New England aster in a prairie, but in a glade, you want to go with a smaller silky aster, the purple coneflower versus the glade coneflower, the showy and Riddell's goldenrod, which are taller, the shorter cliff goldenrod. And realize prairies are adapted to warm, sunny conditions, but glades are adapted to hot, sunny conditions. All right, so here we are in the southwest corner of our house. It is the hottest part. Underneath this mulch, this scattering of mulch, I have found that the previous owners had 3 layers of landscaping rock. Oh my goodness. The base layer was a reddish brown volcanic rock. On top of that was a white quartz-like rock layer. And on top of that was more of the brown volcanic rock. The soil was nutrient poor, probably fill dirt. The location was hot with rocky, poor soils. What does that remind me of? Hey, natural conditions. It sounds like a glade. So this is where we're going to put our glade, in this full sun, rocky, poor soil. And just one other design concept here. See the square corners? See the square corners? To me, from a design standpoint, this is not very aesthetically pleasing. okay? In fact, what I did, I was thinking about expanding the bed, but when I saw these square corners, I laid out a rope and basically smoothed out those corners. I scalped the grass here and put down some weed fabric at the beginning. And this was what I ended up with. Here you can see, but that to me is aesthetically much more pleasing. I did get some rocks from my last house. So I brought some rocks along with a few plants and I put them in there. And I put a little mulch on top. And here is our glade bed that's planted in June of 2018. Okay. A year later, got some nice growth from several plants, some of the cone flowers. This is one of the most attractive milkweeds. It's called butterfly milkweed. It is spectacular with the butterflies. 2 years later, some of the indigos, the blue wild indigos, started coming along. Blue wild indigos or baptisia are great plants. The bumblebees love them. They also have the yellow and cream varieties, species. And then 3 years later, the plants are really filling in the in-between spaces. Like prairies, glades, the peak of flowering is in the summer. But why not go ahead and increase that bloom chronology, like I said at the beginning under guidelines, and plant some, pick out some early glade flowering species. You can see some pussy toes here, and there are some downy phlox. Downy phlox is a wonderful early blooming glade plant. Notice the decorative apple butter kettle, which I drilled holes in the bottom. This is sort of a mini glade within a glade. But here you can see the progression of flowers and pussy toes to the miniature spiderwort to the fame flowers. So in containers, it's also like a glade as well. But some of the star performers here in our glade were the fringed blue stars, our threadleaf blue stars, the miniature spiderwort, which you just saw, the fame flower, prairie dock, which should be glade dock because they grow more on glades than they do on prairies. And again, the predators such as the praying mantises and things. So again, all of these species are highly functional as pollinator plants. And there is 2 species of golden Alexander, which are the one of the prime larval sources for black swallowtail butterflies, besides being good with the solitary bees. There's the taller golden Alexander, the straight species, and then the smaller heart-shaped golden Alexander. I have gotten black swallowtails on these 2 golden Alexanders every year. So it's a great plant for butterfly larval sources. In the fall, again, the silky asters are very small, and the cliff goldenrod, great nectar sources, pollen sources for migrating monarchs and the fall lovers. The best plant, though, I like in the glade is a plant called rose verbena. It's a short plant, very beautiful pink blossoms. The skippers love it, the small butterflies, the big butterflies, hummingbird and clearwings love it, the moths. But I couldn't get it to stay alive because rose verbena does not like wet feet, which means it doesn't like moist or wet soils. And even though this was flat and hot and dry, it was still not doing very well. So what I did is I got my 4x6 trailer and went down and got some topsoil, and I made a mound or a berm. And that's where I planted my rose verbena, and you can see the result. See how it just really loved that drainage. It really liked to have that moisture wicked away here. So it was very happy then. All right, so going back, those are our sun-loving. So now I'm going to be planting in our woodland or forest beds. This was our prime forest bed. This was highly shaded bed filled with English ivy, wild onions, more trumpet creeper, which I pulled out by hand and tilled. I repeated this process several days. This was fairly labor intensive, but the bed was relatively small, so I felt that it wasn't too bad of an investment. But English ivy is the dickens of a time getting it out. So you got to get all those pieces of roots. So I let it go for a while and see what resprouted. And here in May 2018, this is where I planted my small woodland seedlings. And I planted them in about 10-inch centers. And a little later, then I added some real fine, like leaf compost. It's finely ground compost that would break down. If you have a compost pile, this is a great use of compost to add this to your woodland wildflower bed, because woodland wildflowers really like rich, nutrient-rich beds. Normally, I don't amend the soil in my beds. This is the exception. Here, the soil was probably a very organically poor, heavy clay fill. And forest wildflowers do best in rich, organic soil that is naturally found in most bottomland forests. All right, so this is where we planted. A year later, here you can see some of the flowers already starting, like Bradburn's Monarda and the pink. The forest perennials do best in April and May. That's when they shine the most. That's when the peak of their flowering. Remember, prairies and glades, it's later in the summer. So I put out a few solitary bee houses to help pollination and the local solitary bee population. The next year, in year 2, I put a few more houses. I covered up some of that bare concrete. You can see the plants are filling in really nicely. And then in the 3rd year, they were really filling in nicely. The plants are nice and mature. And Jacob's Ladder is just going to town. The columbine, and I put in a few accent plants here, some ferns and other things. But this, we were really happy with this, how it turned out in about 3 years. I did utilize to help suppress weeds. I put in a few ground covers within this bed, the miniature crested irises, which spread out, as do the wild ginger. But realize this is for full shade. They do best in full shade. They do not do well in sun. All right, and here's some of my favorites. The Jacob's Ladder, like I said, has this beautiful, delicate, purplish white flower. There's a few specialist bees that only pollinate that, but a few generalists will also. Nice mound farming wild geranium. The columbine, which attracts hummingbirds, as does the Indian pink a little, but Indian pink usually flowers a little later. Most of these other forest perennials, April and May, but this one waits until June to come along. All right, as promised, here we are back to native vines. Here is my suggested way to plant vines. Structural support in the form of a trellis. So the vine's aggressiveness can be contained. Our trellis was made out of 4x4 frame with a couple of 4x8 pieces of cedar colored plastic lattice attached with wood screws to the opposite sides of the 4x4. So there's two lattices there, one this side, one other side. To avoid freezing and cracking damage to the plastic, I drilled oversized holes for the screws into the 4x4s to allow for the expansion and contraction of the plastic. If you tighten those up, it'll crack and break on you. Since we love hummingbirds, here you can see it, it's right next to the woodland wildflower garden. We love hummingbirds, so we planted coral honeysuckle during the 2nd year. So this trellis not only provides structural support for the native vine, but it also acts as a screen if you want to sit here and have some, a dinner without having your neighbor watch you. And here it is in about 1.5 years growth. The coral honeysuckle starts flowering about the time that the hummingbirds return back to the St. Louis area. All right, and now we get into the forest setting in the back, in the very backyard. Under the black cherry forest trees in the backyard, we planted some large pots of shade-adapted shrubs and small trees, such as spicebush, rough-leaf dogwood, and pawpaw to furnish caterpillar food for spicebush and zebra swallowtail butterflies. If you look at the ground layer, we also planted these small sedges, which later grew into a nice ground cover that helps cut down on weeding. So a ground layer of sedges goes a long way. However, most shrubs are adapted to growing in the sun. In fact, the more sun, the more they produce flowers and fruits. On the east side of our house, where we have non-native warm season zoysia grass growing, I rented a walk-behind sod cutting machine to remove most of the zoysia so I could replant it in another portion of the yard. I thought about doing this in the backyard too, but grandkids actively play in the backyard, so that was off limits. But here is the shrub bed. I took advantage, our property line goes right here, so I brought the bed edge very close to the property line. All this sod was removed because of some residual roots of the zoysia. I covered this triangular bed with weed fabric and topped it off with wood mulch. Okay, pieces of the black drainage tiles to keep the rabbits from nipping off the young growth. After 2.5 years, here are some of our star natives. This first one is Ozark or Vernal witch hazel. It's the first native woody plant to flower. It starts about Martin Luther King Day, towards the end of January into February, and it is super fragrant, and it keeps that fragrance for several weeks, and it's a great species for early pollinators. It is fly pollinated, actually. The second that we're really happy about in this triangular shrub bed is the 9-bark, just a whole bunch of these flower heads, and the honeybees and solitary bees love it. And the third isn't as much as a wildlife plant as an aesthetic plant. It's the fringe tree, nice, unusual flowers and large leaves. So now we're going to switch to the last part, which has to do with water. Stormwater management, or how to keep the rainfall on your property as much as possible. Besides rain barrels, our house was L-shaped. We put this sun roof in, and in the middle of our L-shaped house, and we got a lot of rain falling in this corner. In fact, we had to put a large, oversized downspout on it. So here is the downspout here behind this barbecue grill that I had there temporarily. I went ahead and got a hose and sort of outlined where I maybe wanted to put it. And then I started digging, and I roughed out a place here. I made this a little deeper than it shows here, but then I put a little rubber underneath there, right underneath the top layer of concrete blocks to make sure the soil wouldn't wash out. And then I added a couple of drains here, so if the water would top and maybe start eroding away at the soil in between the blocks, this would take a lot of the water away. I used my handy dandy 4x6 trailer and went and got a rain garden mix composed of sand and compost from St. Louis Composting. And that's what I used to grow my rain garden plants in. In October of 2018, I made my initial native planting with shining blue star and Culver's root, swamp milkweed, and in the gravel above, I put in some buttonbush. I noticed at first, without these rocks, the gravel was being washed away and the velocity of the water. So I put this stair step of flat rocks, and it seemed to spread out the water a little bit and slow the velocity so it wouldn't wash so much. And I put some rocks here to keep the gravel from spilling into the rain garden mix. So here, after 10 months, I did get some good growth from the swamp milkweed. You can see it's attracting the monarchs and the bumblebees and other things. So after 10 months, they were really starting to shine. The next year, about a year and a half, I started adding some spice or some cardinal flowers. And the cardinal flowers produce these beautiful red spikes of red flowers that drive the hummingbirds nuts. I mean, they just can't get enough of cardinal flowers. It is spectacular how they start fighting. The hummingbirds start fighting over the cardinal plants, cardinal flowers. All right. So here we have the shining blue star. We have the Culver's root, and then the cardinal flowers. And again, the plants are very attractive, very beneficial to wildlife. The swamp milkweed, the monarchs, of course, they lay their eggs. The caterpillars eat the leaves. The adult monarchs love the flowers for nectar, pollen, and as do the solitary bees. The Culver's root, they also call it the candelabra plant. It does look very beautiful. Buttonbush almost looks like rattlesnake master with a round globe of white flowers, and then the cardinal flower. Again, the butterfly or the hummingbird magnet. The last thing, and we're winding down here, is the bubbler. We wanted a bubbler. We had a water garden before, but it was high maintenance, and we didn't want to have a high maintenance water feature. So the sound of the bubbling and the falling water not only gets the attention here of the animals, but it is very soothing for us as well. We hired an outfit called, what was it called? Land Works. And they went ahead and dug it and put in the echo blocks for us that basically act as the water reserve. Oh, I did want to say here, the rock, we went to a few landscape places around St. Louis. They didn't have any that really tickled our fancy, so we went down to Simcoe Rock down in Prairieville and picked out this 800-pounder here, had them drill the hole for the water to bubble out the top. And we had it here on a pallet. We had to move our bird feeding station. And so here is what it was in the building process, and here it is finished. You can see the water is bubbling out. It's falling in little pools here. And this is all that echo block with rock on top of it. We did end up moving our bird feeding station away from it because we didn't want the seed falling into the rocks here and following the reservoir underground. So that's some of the before and after pictures. Realize that these bubblers will go year round. They are spectacular in the winter. You'll get great visitation from a lot of birds that normally don't come to feeders. But I did want to share a few other tidbits of information about things like where should I go and buy my native plants? Because people always say, where do you get your plants? Where do you get your seed? Where do you get your seedlings? What you don't want to do is buy from any big box store. You do not know where the seeds were obtained, where they were grown. A lot of them are grown in warmer climates, different climates, and many big box stores sell plants full of pesticides. So don't get them from the big box stores. And I recommend not buying native cultivars because they're clones. They alter the anatomy and a lot of times the functioning of the native plant species. So where do you go? You buy locally from a nursery that ethically obtains seeds from a nearby source. the best resource is part of the packet we have for this series, and it's the Grow Native website. Every year they have a new resource guide where they list all the different ethical seed nurseries, native nurseries around. This is from last year, but they also have one out now, 2022, the Grow Native Resource Guide. That's where to get the names of the place that's closest to you. All right. If you would like to visit residential yards with native plants, there are two opportunities coming up: the Open Yards program and the St. Louis Native Plant Garden Tour. Both of these will start registrations in April sometime. The Open Yards program is a new one. It allows people to visit landscapes at various times during the growing season. The tour here is all 10 yards, all in one day, the June 11th, that is, this year. But both are very educational. So if you want to see some examples of home native landscapes, that's where to go. And there are a number of other places to take native landscaping classes. See the supplemental information from this series. So the full list. I teach some classes over at Merrimack. I teach some Go Native, wildflower, insect, landscaping for bees and pollinators, some tours of public gardens, and in the fall, I teach an Ozark ecology. It's an academic course for 8 weeks. It's a 3-hour course, and that concludes my presentation. Sarah.
Well, thank you so much, Dave. That was wonderful. See if my video, there we go, catches up. We have had quite a few wonderful questions. And so let me take a look at, someone's just told me that something didn't work, but I don't know what it was. So if you could let me know, because I'm juggling a lot of chats here. All right, so the first question, I think is a good one. You mentioned at the beginning the keystone native plants, and someone wasn't familiar with what that referred to. If you wouldn't mind just filling people in on that briefly before we get to the other questions.
There's a saying, all plants are not created equally. And our first speaker last week, Doug Tallamy, did some wonderful research on caterpillar foods. Some plants, some native plant species produce more caterpillar species than others, because caterpillars are the key to getting wildlife in your yard, because they serve as a source for energy transfer. And some plants, like Doug talked about last week with oak trees, they basically provide larval source for over 500 caterpillars around here. So dogwoods and a number of other species are very good. So these are the plants that are the most beneficial to wildlife. And we're talking primarily caterpillars, but then there's also good pollinator plants and nectar plants in general as well. So those are the keystones.
Okay, thank you so much for giving everybody a little bit more background on that.
All native plants will have something that eats it, because it's evolved here, but some are just a little head and shoulders above the others. Those are the keystone species.
All right, wonderful. So we had, like I said, we have a lot of good questions. As far as preparing the spaces that you have transformed, there were some questions about the honeysuckle bushes. One was, what chemical did you use specifically on the stumps? And did you have to wait to plant anything else there after having used that?
The chemical I used was the glyphosate, which is the active ingredient, in Roundup, but you can buy it in a generic version as well. But when you use that, again, use protective gloves and personal apparel, but be real careful when you're working with this. I don't really believe in using pesticides and toxins in the yard, with these exceptions. And what you want to do on that bush honeysuckle trunk is, when you cut it in the actively growing season, you cut it, and on that fresh cut, that's where you put your your glyphosate concentrate on there, and it'll be absorbed into the root system so you won't get resprouting. And you can plant underneath that as soon as possible, because it doesn't migrate, it stays put. It stays put.
All right. And a follow-up question to that was, when removing the brush, so far there was someone who had commented that they had removed quite a lot, and they had a pile of brush that the neighbors probably didn't appreciate, but they're concerned about moving it and spreading, I guess, spreading seeds as they do. So any recommendations for how to get rid of brush?
If the seeds are, if the fruits are on it, that's a hard thing, because they're going to fall off, and some people will run it through a grinder. They'll run a grinder for 3-4 hours and run it through there. That cuts down on it. What you can do is stack it and let the seeds fall out, and then again dig up the seedlings that will come out. But the grinder probably is the best way to work with that. But preferably you want to cut these puppies down before they go to fruit. Okay, get them when they're flowering and things, and that's when you want to get the bush honeysuckles out before they go to fruit, if at all possible.
Wonderful, thank you. Yeah, that's something one might not be thinking about until it's too late. So that's a good tip. So to continue on that, to the good kind of honeysuckle, those honeysuckle vines, do you recommend cutting those back in the or no, I might get that wrong. So, but anyway, do you recommend cutting those back each year? And what was a good time to do that? I think that was the question.
The coral honeysuckle is just basically it touches the state of Missouri, right down by the boot heel. It's from a pure standpoint, a puristic standpoint, it doesn't actually occur very much in Missouri, if at all, but it's very close. But this is what we consider a native, but the hummingbirds just absolutely love it. So that's why we started making exception in this case. But like I said, all vines need to be chased and contained. The coral honeysuckle keeps growing up, so I weave some of the runners back through it and make it, a nice bunch. But sometimes you just got to trim the heck out of it. And what was the last part of that?
I think when it is a good time of year to do that?
Okay. Basically, it's best to trim it when it's the greatest risk you have is getting fungi on the cuts. So if you can do it during the colder months, that's the best time. And if you're going to have to trim other times, there's not a bunch of exposure with those vines. So that one, it doesn't really make that much difference. If you're talking about an area that's good size and you're making a deep wound on a shrub or a big woody a tree, then you're more worried about, you want to do that during the cold months. And some people will go ahead and sometimes treat that also with different protectants also. And the old German school, they used to paint them white. There's other things, but just do it during the cold months is the best method.
Okay, great. We had a couple of questions about some of the materials used, like the fencing and the weed fabric. But before I do that, since we're kind of running a little bit short on time, I want to ask if there's a chance you could run through real quickly that side bed with the wall. We had a lot of folks asking that they didn't quite catch, I think, what the shout outs were for, which plants those were for, and what the two aggressive plants that you mentioned, the two shrubs.
The premise here is I'm trying to take advantage of semi or mildly aggressive plants to keep the weeds down. So if you use some native plants that are aggressive, you can take advantage of this aggressive nature. And especially when I had that bare cement wall, I wanted something to screen some of that. So those two shout out species were the hairy mountain mint and the aromatic aster. Now, I would not put either of those two things, especially the aromatic aster, which is a little bit more aggressive, in a bed because you may risk it taking over that bed. But on the side yard, I wanted it to go wild. I wanted it to just take over and just outcompete everything else, especially the weeds. So there you're taking advantage of the aggressive nature of some of the natives. So some things you don't want to put into the big beds. That's one that you shouldn't.
I like that idea that, you know, not all plants are bad. They just have to be in the right spot.
Right
Aggressive isn't
plant.
necessarily bad.
Right. The old gardener's motto.
Um, yeah. So let's jump to the so we had a lot of questions about the rabbit fence. We always have questions about our wildlife when we have a gardening presentation. And so a lot of folks wanted to know if there is a time when one might hope to remove any rabbit fencing once those plants have been established. Have you had success or have you done
Well,
so?
the woodies are most vulnerable when they're young. And I've lost a lot of little seedlings because I'm cheap. I buy the little plants, you know, the little shrubs and everything. And if you get that nice 45-degree angle and it's a pure, clean cut, that's rabbit. That's just
Mhm.
eating the tops off all your little woody seedlings. So I get the fence, and if you notice, I didn't point that out, but the fencing I get, it's small holes at the bottom, and it gets progressively bigger as you go up to the top. You got to make sure that you get that fencing dug in a little bit. Use some little clips to make sure that that stays down, because the rabbits can dig, but normally they don't that much. But those, if you put a prairie out there, that's going to produce a lot of understory, and wood piles are great for rabbits, and brush piles. I don't get into brush piles. Brush piles, if you want rabbits, put more brush piles out there. Okay. And to be fair now, I try to prevent them from coming in, but as we put more native plants out here, we've gotten more predators. We've gotten a family of barred owls that have come in. They've nested about 200 feet from our house. And when the barred owls came in, all of a sudden the rabbit population went down. Figure that one out. So, and we also have red fox. Red fox are fantastic rabbit eaters. So again, you have this network of plants and animals, and the predators somehow help out. But sometimes around woodies, you got to leave that drain tile until it starts getting a fairly good size on it, and then you can remove the drain tile. And for the perennial, the prairies, I just leave it up. I took some rebar and painted it green to match the fence, and that way it blends in with the prairie plants a little bit more. But I do leave that around the prairie.
Yeah. And I think that's also the bad news. You know, everyone always wants to know what can one do plant wise to deter deer, and I've heard time and time again that it's fencing. So unless you have some magical uh, solution, I have a feeling your response is the same.
Right. Well, there's differences, and I'm sure some of the other speakers along the series will talk about this. There's some plants that are more relished by deer than others, and there's some that are less desirable, you know, to deer. So there's a number of resources on that. So I'm sure they'll bring them up later.
Indeed. But I think your point about the predators is a really great one about native landscaping, is that it is a whole ecosystem that you're inviting, you're building and making stronger. So hopefully things start to balance out the more things resemble the way they support the animals and insects, et cetera, in our lives.
As that energy is transferred, then it gets some abundant songbirds. You're going to have Cooper's hawks coming in, visiting your feeder or your prairie. We've seen Cooper's hawks zip away with a songbird or two, and you know, it's
Circle
life.
of life.
But that's you know, there's certain things that tell you if you're successful in a native landscaping: reproduction, having food, and then predation. If you have predation in your yard, you know your natives are working, and it's a thumbs up when you get that kind of predation.
Yeah, absolutely. So we had a lot of questions about specific things, and I'll try to share some resources with folks about, how to plant things, when to plant them, that are in our collection. But I guess this may be a good one to leave on, to end on. Um, how does the prairie, once you plant these gardens, is it a struggle to keep them contained, or do they generally kind of stay put where you
Once,
plant them?
once you establish your prairies, they are low maintenance. But again, it's getting those seeds and those plants fairly, growing compact, making a network. And you might get a few things coming in every once in a while, but as far as weeds and maintenance, uh, the only thing with the prairie stems, you want to collect a few of those. Again, store them in the back of the yard, out of sight. But some of the other ones, you can go ahead and just mulch up, run over with the lawnmower and things. But during the active growing season, I don't have to do a lot to my prairies, which is really nice, really nice. So again, that's what we're after. The natives start maintaining themselves. They fill in the gaps, the in-between spaces, and they don't give a lot of opportunities. Where there's bare ground, something is going to go ahead and try to colonize it. So,
Yeah.
and sometimes bare ground in the back of the yard is good because that's maybe where ground nesting solitary bees make their nests. But bare ground in your bed sometimes isn't what you want.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Dave. This was so informative. I know a lot of comments about all the notes people have been taking, and trying to wrap around how to make this kind of transformation in their own yard. So you've definitely inspired everyone today. All this good information. If there was something that you missed and you wanted to revisit, anybody watching, remember this recording will be emailed out to you when it's posted to YouTube. So keep an eye out for
Native
that.
landscaping, native
Yes.
landscaping. It's it's
And
it's 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 super.
I'm not much of a gardener, but this definitely inspires me too. So thank
Good,
you.
good, good.
And thank you again for being with us. Thank you all for being here and listening to the presentation. We hope you join us for more of the Partners in Native Landscaping series. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves. See y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.